So my name is Brian Summers, and for my capstone project, I conducted an assessment of the South Korean-U.S. alliance. So to give a little background on this issue and to explain why it's important, I'm going to go back to a quote from recent 2+2 talks between U.S. and RoK leaders. And so the RoK-US alliance has been described as the linchpin of peace, security, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific by top U.S. statesmen and Korean statesmen alike. And so despite this, in recent years, the alliance has faced geopolitical headwinds in the context of the rise of China and the unilateralism of the previous U.S. administration. And so these challenges and constraints led me to try to answer the question, what explains South Korean-U.S. alliance dynamics? And so, first of all, I conducted a literature review, and this was kind of difficult because the range of opinions on this issue is quite wide, but I tried to pick three schools of thought that I think encompass kind of the three different options South Korea has in terms of this alliance. So there's the balance of power school put forth by Ross in 2010. He argues that South Korea should accommodate China while lessening ties with the U.S. And he's basically made this argument that as China has increased its capabilities in the region, South Korea is similarly aligned with those capabilities. But some critiques of this school point to the fact that despite China's rising capabilities, U.S. and South Korea have increased alliance policy coordination in some areas despite this. And so then there's the balance of threat school put forth by David Kong in 2009. And Kong basically eschews balance of power dynamics and argues that South Korea should pursue a nuanced approach focused on shared interests. So Kong kind of explains that it's interests and perceptions that are shaping South Korea's alliance posturing, and that there's no fundamental threat they view from China, and so therefore they're not trying to contain or balance China, and so the U.S. alliance is fundamentally just postured towards North Korea, and so there's no real threat towards the alliance as it is now. But some critiques of this is that in the past 10 years since this work was written, there's been a lot of challenges between South Korea and China and South Korea and the U.S. So this kind of points to some of the flaws of this school. And then to follow that up, there's a liberal school from Hyunju Yu in 2013. And Yu basically argues that it's the perceived usefulness of China that explains South Korea's alliance posturing towards the U.S. So South Korea should ally with the U.S. due to the constant threat of North Korea and the need for the U.S. security assurance, but while avoiding tension with China because at times China is useful and has shared alignments in how to deal with North Korea. So these three schools of thought can kind of be broken down into this framework that I used to inform my argument. And so this framework was created by Scott Snyder in his book South Korea and Alliance-Autonomy in the Era of Rival Powers. And so this framework puts forth basically four different directions that South Korea can head with its alliances. In the poles, if you can see, are international with the y-axis, international versus parochialness, which is inwardly oriented, or autonomy versus allianceness. And so Snyder uses three determinants of South Korea's alliance with the U.S., and this is the relative balance of power between the U.S. and China, the degree of discordance or accordance between the U.S. and China, and then lastly, the ongoing desire for strategic autonomy from great power relations in South Korea. And it's this last point that I think Snyder fails to really accurately account for. And so that's what motivated my study to further look at this desire for strategic autonomy and how it affects the South Korean-U.S. alliance. So my central argument is that South Korea's pursuit of strategic autonomy has led it to diverge from U.S. alliance dependence through strategies of middle power diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. So for my research design, I used two case studies. I chose these case studies because I think they relate to these two strategies I just outlined. And that is with the decision not to join the Quad. You all might know that the Quad is a group of four countries, the U.S., Australia, Japan, and India, that on paper it's meant to deal with a wide range of Indo-Pacific matters. In between the lines, it's mainly an effort to contain China. And so South Korea's decision not to join the Quad exemplifies this strategic autonomy pursuit through strategic ambiguity. And then my other case selection is President Moon Jae-in's New Southern Policy. And the purpose of the new Southern policy is to elevate the role of ASEAN and Southern neighbors to the status of South Korea's traditional top four foreign policy partners, that being the US, China, Japan, and Russia. And so by trying to elevate these middle power countries to the same status of its relations with these great powers, South Korea is pursuing a middle power diplomacy to cover our own niche for it to have some strategic autonomy. And so I chose a little bit to explain the methodology of why I chose these case studies. Is that one, like I said, they illustrate these two aspects of autonomy, and then also their recent developments with little scholarship. And so this leads me to my findings, in that I agree with Snyder's findings in that there's a short-term outlook. The short-term outlook for the RoK-US alliance looks relatively consistent, and without any major changes, it's likely to maintain stable or to keep being stable. However, in terms of the long-term outlook, I think the South Korea will continue pursuing alternative means of security beyond the U.S. alliance, likely through these measures or through these strategies of middle power diplomacy and strategic ambiguity. And this has led me to really conclude that strategic autonomy is a core tenet of South Korea's foreign policy goals, and that allied neighbors need to respect this foreign policy goal. And so the implications of my findings, I think South Korea's receptiveness to the U.S. alliance in the future will depend on the nature and scope of U.S. diplomatic overtures. So if there's a rehashing of the prior U.S. administration's unilateralism and kind of flippant requests for more troops and more funding from South Korea, South Korea will probably more aggressively pursue this independent space for its foreign policy and try to lessen dependence on the U.S. alliance. So future U.S. policymakers will need to keep this in mind as they conduct policy on the Korean Peninsula. And so lastly, my final thoughts is that while not abandoning the U.S. alliance completely, South Korea will likely continue to carve space for itself to conduct an independent foreign policy due to this long-standing and ongoing desire for strategic autonomy from great power relations. And that concludes my assessment.